An orderly hit the corpse of the billionaire's wife right in the morgue. No one expected what happened next. It shocked everyone who was around. Subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching this video from. Naomi Moore had always known how it felt to be invisible in plain sight. Working at Halcyon Medical Center, a pristine, glass-walled facility nestled in one of the wealthiest enclaves of the city, meant she was surrounded by opulence, precision, and a quiet kind of cruelty masked as professionalism. Every corridor gleamed under white LED lights, the floors polished to a mirror-like sheen. A scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, sterilizing not just bacteria but emotion, warmth, and occasionally dignity. At 28, Naomi was the youngest in her department and the only black woman in the entire morgue staff. Officially, she was a certified patient care technician, assigned to assist with autopsy preparation, body handling, and sanitation. Unofficially, she was the one they called for when someone vomited in the hallway or when the smell in a cold chamber grew too strong for anyone else to stomach. She did her work quietly, efficiently, and without protest. Years of practice had taught her that dissent only drew more attention, unwelcome attention. She had learned early on that excellence was her only shield, and even then, it was often as thin as tissue. Most days passed in a routine blur. Bodies in, paperwork processed, bodies out. Naomi had grown used to death, not in a morbid or detached way, but with the clinical familiarity of someone who handled it daily. But even familiarity didn't erase the humanity in her. It was what made her different from the others. She still said quiet prayers when zipping up body bags. She still remembered faces, especially the young ones. She still looked for signs of peace or pain on lifeless expressions. And that morning, as she arrived just before dawn, coffee in one hand and her ID badge swinging from the other, she had no idea that everything would change. The day began with whispers. Quiet, clipped conversations between supervisors and administrators that stopped the moment Naomi entered a room. She noticed the tension, the stiffer posture of the guards near the loading dock, the unusual presence of executives walking briskly through restricted corridors. Then came the formal call to her department. A high-profile body was on its way, and Naomi was to assist in its intake. She heard the name before she saw the face. Clarissa Whitmore. Naomi froze for a moment. That name, Clarissa Whitmore, was everywhere. She was the wife of Gregory Whitmore, tech billionaire and real estate mogul, one of the richest men in the country. The couple were fixtures on society pages, regularly photographed at galas, premieres, and fundraising events. Naomi had seen Clarissa's face in glossy magazines, always radiant in designer gowns, always smiling with lips that never quite met her eyes. And now, she was dead. The body arrived under tight security. 2 black SUVs parked at the service entrance, and men in suits accompanied the transfer from the vehicle to the cold chamber. A clipboard with official documentation changed hands quickly. Naomi took the body with another assistant named Carl, who kept glancing nervously at the guards. The moment the body was secured, the men vanished, as if they hadn't been there at all. Naomi signed the intake log and rolled the stretcher into Chamber B. She expected to feel detached, just as she always did with high-profile cases, but the moment she pulled back the sheet and looked at the face of Clarissa Whitmore, something inside her shifted. Clarissa's skin was pale, but not the waxen gray Naomi had come to associate with the dead. There was a subtle flush beneath the cheeks, as if she had just come in from the cold. Her lips weren't dry or discolored. They looked freshly glossed, and her hair, blonde, glossy, styled into soft waves, lay almost too perfectly around her face. Naomi felt a ripple of unease. She had seen hundreds of bodies, rich, poor, young, old. She knew how death settled into flesh. This didn't feel right. She reached forward with gloved hands and pressed her fingers gently against the underside of the woman's arm. The skin was cooler than life, yes, but not icy. There was still elasticity. No sign of lividity or rigor mortis. She checked the ankles, the same. Slight tension, as if the muscles hadn't fully relaxed. "Carl," she said, keeping her voice low, "something's off." He didn't look up from the tray of instruments he was arranging. Off how? Naomi hesitated. Her skin, there's warmth. Her lips. She looks alive. Carl snorted. She's not. We've got certified documentation from 2 physicians. Death declared at 11:42 p.m. last night. Heart attack. But, Naomi, he interrupted, turning to face her with a hint of irritation, don't start. You think you're the first tech to get spooked by a high-profile body. It's nerves. Ignore it. Do your job. She swallowed her retort and nodded. Carl left soon after, saying he needed to prep for the 9 a.m. autopsy, and she could finish the cleaning and logging. The morgue fell silent except for the hum of refrigeration units and the distant echo of voices in another wing. Naomi stood alone beside the table, her heart pounding louder than before. She leaned in and studied Clarissa's face again. There was something too composed, too preserved, as if someone had tried to make her look dead rather than her actually being so. Her instincts screamed that something wasn't right. She checked the monitors in the chamber. No abnormalities. All paperwork was there. And yet, she couldn't shake the sense that the woman in front of her wasn't meant to be here. She thought about what would happen in the next few hours. A scalpel would slice open that flawless chest. The heart, if it had truly stopped, would be examined, weighed, reported on. But what if it hadn't stopped? What if someone had made a mistake? Or worse, what if this wasn't a mistake at all? Naomi stared at Clarissa's face for a long time. Then she did something she couldn't explain, not even to herself. Slowly, hesitantly, she lifted her right hand and brought it down across the woman's cheek. The sound cracked through the chamber like a gunshot. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Naomi stared in horror at the faint red mark blooming on Clarissa's face, already regretting the impulse. Then, just as she turned to grab a towel, Clarissa's eyelids fluttered. Naomi froze. The motion was subtle, barely a twitch, but unmistakable. Clarissa's fingers twitched, her chest rose, then came a faint, wheezing gasp. "Oh my God," Naomi whispered. "She's alive." She rushed to the side of the table, fumbling for the emergency call button with trembling hands. Her mind spun. She needed help. Someone needed to see this. But in the back of her mind, a cruel voice whispered, "No one will believe you." The door burst open and Carl reappeared, panting. "What the hell was that noise?" He stopped mid-sentence as he saw Clarissa gasp again, this time louder, more desperate. Her eyes opened halfway, glazed with confusion and terror. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, backing away. Naomi moved quickly. "Get a doctor, now!" Carl stumbled out of the room, shouting down the hallway. Naomi stayed with the woman, gently placing her hand on Clarissa's forehead, speaking in low, soothing tones. Clarissa couldn't respond yet, but her eyes clung to Naomi's face like a lifeline. Within moments, chaos erupted. Doctors, nurses, and security flooded the chamber. Naomi was pushed aside as professionals swarmed the table, attaching monitors, taking vitals, injecting stabilizers. Clarissa was alive. Her pulse was weak but present. Her breathing was shallow but real. And then he arrived. Gregory Whitmore strode into the chamber like a storm in a tailored suit. His face was pale with fury, disbelief carved into every sharp angle. He took one look at his wife, then at Naomi, and something ugly settled in his expression. "Who did this?" he demanded. No one answered. His gaze locked on Naomi. "You?" he asked, voice low and sharp. "What did you do to her?" Naomi stood frozen, unable to speak. He stepped closer, his voice rising. "You struck my wife? You put your hands on her body? Are you out of your mind?" "She was alive," Naomi said quietly. "You assaulted her. This is disgusting, inexcusable. Who let someone like you near her?" The words landed like stones. "Someone like you." Naomi felt the room tilt. The others said nothing. No one spoke up for her. No one mentioned the red on Clarissa's cheeks, or the fact that Naomi's intuition had saved a life. As doctors wheeled Clarissa out toward intensive care, Naomi remained behind. Alone, cold, trembling. She didn't know yet that this moment, this impossible moment, would become the catalyst for everything that followed. The headlines, the investigation, the revelations. She didn't know that a single slap would unravel an empire built on lies. All she knew was that something was very, very wrong. And now she was in the middle of it. The cold fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly as Naomi stood outside the intensive care unit, her body taut with a tension that gripped every muscle. The chaos that had erupted just moments ago had settled into an eerie quiet. Behind the sealed glass doors, Clarissa Whitmore lay connected to machines that blinked and hissed, keeping her body stable, alive, breathing. That single fact should have been a triumph, yet all Naomi could feel was the weight of suspicion tightening around her neck like an invisible noose. She had not moved since Clarissa was wheeled away, her hands still faintly trembling. Her knuckles were stiff from where she'd instinctively gripped the edge of the autopsy table. A nurse brushed past her without making eye contact. Another staff member whispered something to a colleague down the hall, glancing sideways at Naomi before turning away sharply. No one congratulated her. No one asked how she knew. No one said thank you. She felt like a ghost in the building where she worked every day, suddenly more visible than ever, but not in the way she had hoped. Before, she had been invisible because they deemed her unworthy of notice. Now, she was the center of attention because they deemed her dangerous. The buzz of voices reached her ears again, and she turned slightly. A cluster of men stood a few feet away, gesturing in hushed tones. At the center of them was Gregory Whitmore. His presence was impossible to ignore, a man so used to commanding the room that even silence bent around him. His voice was low but sharp, every syllable edged in ice. "I want names," he snapped. "Who authorized this woman to be alone with my wife? Who signed off on the staff schedule? There's going to be a lawsuit, a public one. I'll tear this place apart." "She saved her," one voice dared to interject, tentative, almost drowned in the current of Whitmore's anger. "Saved her?" he repeated incredulously, his eyes narrowing. "Is that what you call this? My wife was assaulted in a morgue, slapped by a technician. On whose authority? Don't talk to me about saving. Talk to me about protocol. Where the hell was the oversight?" Naomi looked away before his gaze could find hers again. She didn't need to see the contempt on his face. She had felt it. Deep, raw, personal. The implication had been clear. Someone like her had no business laying a hand on someone like his wife. She turned and began walking down the hallway, her breath catching with each step. Her name had been taken for incident reports. She'd been asked to wait for a formal statement. but no one had told her where to go, what to do. She didn't want to go back to the break room where stairs awaited, so she headed toward the only place that had always felt, strangely, like a refuge, the morgue. The silence welcomed her like an old friend, cold, still, predictable. She stepped inside Chamber B, where it had all happened, and just stood. The room looked the same as before, nothing out of place, instruments aligned, floor clean. Yet everything had changed. The echo of her own voice from earlier that morning seemed to linger in the air. She could almost hear it again. "She's alive." Had she hesitated even a moment longer, Clarissa might now be lying on that same table, lifeless for real. The thought made her knees weak. She pulled up a stool and sat down, burying her face in her hands. She hadn't meant to hit the woman, not violently. It hadn't been an act of aggression, but a desperate attempt to provoke any sign, any movement, any flutter, any whisper of life. She had followed a gut feeling so strong it had drowned logic, protocol, and fear. And it had been right. But no one cared about that. They cared about optics, about appearances, about scandal. A black woman laying hands on the alabaster face of a society icon. The slap was already a metaphor in people's minds, whether they realized it or not. A line had been crossed, and not just professionally. The door behind her creaked open. Naomi turned sharply, expecting another nurse or perhaps a supervisor. Instead, it was Carl, his face pale, his brow creased with uncertainty. "They're asking for you," he said flatly. "Who?" "Admin and maybe legal, I don't know. People in suits." She nodded slowly and stood up. Carl didn't meet her eyes. "Look, I didn't mean to throw you under the bus earlier. I didn't think—" "It's fine," Naomi said quietly. "It's not. It's just, people are scared. This isn't the kind of thing that's supposed to happen, especially not here." She looked at him, holding back everything she wanted to say. Instead, she just nodded again and walked past him. The administrative offices were on the second floor near the executive suite, a place Naomi rarely had reason to visit. As she walked through the polished halls, she was aware of how every step echoed louder than it should, as if her presence alone was causing vibrations. People looked up from their desks, paused mid-sentence. She kept her gaze forward. Inside the conference room, 4 people sat waiting. A woman from HR, a man she recognized from legal, the chief operating officer, and a security officer with a badge on his belt. "Miss Moore," the COO began, gesturing to a seat. "Please, sit." She did, folding her hands in her lap, spine straight. "We'd like to ask you some questions regarding the incident this morning," the HR woman said. "Just routine. Clarify the timeline, your actions, your motivations." Naomi recounted it all, her observations, the signs that made her uneasy, the hesitation, the decision, the slap. "And what, precisely?" the legal officer asked, his pen tapping slowly against the table. "Did you hope to accomplish by striking the body?" "I didn't know what else to do," Naomi said. "I thought, if there was any chance she was alive, I had to provoke a reaction. It wasn't to harm, it was to wake her." "And you believed she might be alive, based on intuition?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yes, intuition and experience." There was a pause. Then the COO leaned forward. "Miss Moore, you must understand how serious this is, from a legal standpoint, from a reputational one. The Whitmore family is not insignificant. Their lawyers are already involved. If you had been wrong—" "But I wasn't," she interrupted, for the first time letting steel into her voice. "She's alive. Because of me." Silence fell. The security officer was the one who finally broke it. "She is," he said, almost reluctantly. Doctors confirmed shallow pulse, extreme hypothermia, barely perceptible vitals. But alive. Naomi's eyes stung with tears she refused to let fall. She would have been autopsied in less than an hour, she said, cut open, and no one would have questioned it, because everything looked right on paper. But something was wrong, and I saw it, because I was paying attention. The HR woman shifted uncomfortably. The legal officer made a note. Finally, the COO spoke again. We're placing you on temporary administrative leave. This is not a disciplinary action. We just need time to complete our investigation. Naomi rose slowly. Am I being blamed for saving her life? You're being protected, the COO said, his voice measured. From the media, from the family, from litigation. Naomi gave a short laugh. That's not what this is, but I understand. She left the room without waiting for dismissal. By the time she reached the elevator, her phone buzzed. A message from a junior nurse she barely knew. You were amazing. I saw it. I believe you. It was a small thing, but it kept her standing. That night, Naomi sat in her modest apartment, staring out the window at the city skyline. Her world had shifted in a matter of hours. She had followed an instinct that defied logic, and it had saved a life. Yet all around her, people were scrambling to erase the narrative, to rewrite the truth in softer terms. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing with certainty. She had done the right thing, even if no one wanted to admit it yet. The morning light filtered through the blinds in Naomi's apartment, casting thin lines of gold across her small living room. She hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard the slap again, the sound echoing in her skull like the chime of a bell that never stopped ringing. She heard the gasp, saw Clarissa's eyelids fluttering open, felt the disbelief and panic swell in the room as life surged back into a body deemed dead. But what haunted her more than the events themselves was the aftermath. The silence. The isolation. The way the truth of what she had done, what she had saved, was being carefully buried beneath the weight of bureaucracy, status, and fear. She had been placed on administrative leave, yes, but everyone knew what that really meant. They were buying time, controlling the story, hoping it would blow over before it got out of hand. Naomi stared at her phone. It buzzed occasionally, mostly with updates from Carl or a nurse or two who had dared to reach out quietly, offering vague reassurances and careful words of encouragement. But the weight of it all sat heavy on her chest. She turned on the television out of instinct. Morning news shows played in succession. Traffic, weather, local politics. Then, just before she turned it off, she heard the name. Clarissa Whitmore. The screen shifted to a news anchor with an expertly neutral expression. Sources close to the Whitmore family confirmed late last night that Clarissa Whitmore, previously reported deceased from cardiac arrest, is currently recovering in an undisclosed medical facility after what officials are calling a misidentified medical condition. Naomi sat forward, her heart pounding. The circumstances surrounding Mrs. Whitmore's recovery remain unclear, though hospital administration has confirmed that an internal investigation is underway to determine how such a critical error occurred. Neither Mr. Whitmore nor the family's representatives have commented publicly. No mention of the morgue, no mention of the autopsy table, no mention of Naomi. Of course not. At Halcyon Medical, the wheels of control were already turning. Across town, inside one of the hospital's secured conference rooms, An emergency meeting convened under the pretense of routine policy review. In truth, it was crisis containment. The legal department, public relations team, and several senior administrators were gathered around a long, glossy table. At the head sat Martin Ellison, the hospital's chief legal counsel. His expression was stone. "This is bigger than we thought," he said, scrolling through an article on his tablet. The Whitmores were supposed to keep this quiet. That was the agreement. But now it's leaking. "They're being careful," said Olivia Marks, the PR director. "No mention of Naomi, no mention of the morgue. They're trying to spin it as a rare medical anomaly." Ellison looked over his glasses. "That's the problem. If people start digging, it'll become very clear where the anomaly occurred, and who caused it." "Caused it?" asked a younger administrator. "She saved that woman's life." Ellison's stare was cold. "You and I both know that doesn't matter. The optics are what matter. A black technician striking a white billionaire's wife in the morgue? That's not a headline we can afford." "So, what do?" Olivia asked. "We control the narrative. We keep Naomi on leave. We conduct a review. Slow, methodical, buried in paperwork. We keep the family placated, and we prepare a fall guy if this breaks wider. And if Naomi speaks, we discredit, gently. Implied negligence, emotional instability, we have options." No one in the room objected. Silence was the cost of keeping jobs. Back in her apartment, Naomi stared at her hands. They felt both powerful and dangerous. She hadn't meant to cause such ripples, but something inside her refused to regret it. That slap, born of desperation and instinct, had changed everything. The problem was that it had changed nothing for her. She was still the suspect, still the threat, still the outsider in the story of her own triumph. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She hesitated, approached, and opened it cautiously. A tall man in a gray overcoat stood on the other side, holding up a badge. "Detective Roman Voloshin," he said, his tone clipped but not unfriendly. "May I come in?" Naomi stepped aside. He entered, surveying the small space with a glance that took in everything without lingering. He remained standing. "I won't take much of your time," he said. "Just a few questions." Naomi nodded, feeling her throat tighten. "You were the first to notice something unusual about the condition of Mrs. Whitmore's body. Is that correct?" "Yes," she said. "She didn't look dead." He raised an eyebrow. "That's a bold assessment. What gave you that impression?" Naomi hesitated. Her skin wasn't cold. There was color in her lips. Her body didn't feel gone. I just felt like she was still there. I can't explain it better than that." He didn't write anything down. "And that's when you decided to strike her?" "It wasn't an attack," she said quickly. "It was a test. I needed a reaction. And you got one." Naomi nodded. Voloshin studied her a moment longer, then moved to the window. "Did you know who she was?" "Of course." "You understood the risk?" "Yes." "And you still did it." She met his eyes. "Because if I hadn't, she'd be dead right now, and everyone would be pretending otherwise." He gave a small nod, not of agreement, but of acknowledgement. Then he pulled a folder from his coat and handed it to her. "Officially, this conversation didn't happen. Unofficially, you should know that I believe you did the right thing." Naomi opened the folder and stared at the contents. Medical reports, logs, a preliminary analysis showing signs consistent with induced metabolic suppression, a coma-like state. "She wasn't dead," Voloshin said, "at least not in the clinical sense. Someone went to great lengths to make it look like she was. That doesn't happen by accident." "Why are you showing me this?" because you're not the only one they're trying to silence, and you might be the only one who saw what they were doing before it was too late." He left without another word. Naomi sat down, folder in her lap, heart thudding. Something deeper was at play. This wasn't just a medical error, it was a scheme, and she had tripped over it by daring to see what others ignored. Across the city, the Whitmore estate buzzed with contained panic. Clarissa, now awake and under guard in a secure wing of a private facility, had begun to speak. Her voice was weak, her memory fragmented, but one thing was clear. She remembered being awake, aware, helpless. She remembered the chill of the morgue, the cold table, the buzz of fluorescent lights, and then the slap, the voice. "She saved me," she whispered to her nurse. "I need to speak to the woman who saved me." But Gregory had other plans. He stood outside her room, surrounded by lawyers and private security, his face a mask of fury. "She doesn't speak to anyone until I say so," he ordered, "especially not her." Behind the glass, Clarissa turned her face to the wall, but the wheel had already begun to turn. The next morning, headlines broke through the silence. "Socialite awakens after apparent death." "Whitmore wife in medical miracle." Questions were raised. Anonymous sources hinted at inconsistencies. A whistleblower leaked internal emails from the hospital, and the name Naomi Moore began to circulate. Not as a villain, but as a hero. Small at first, a whisper, a tweet, a post, then louder, and with it, the truth began to rise. Not everyone wanted it, but it was coming. Clarissa Whitmore lay beneath crisp white linens, the private hospital suite silent except for the gentle beeping of monitors and the soft hum of the climate control system. The world outside buzzed with intrigue and speculation, but within these walls she felt suspended in a liminal space between two versions of herself, one buried by the official narrative and another slowly crawling back to life. Each breath she took seemed heavier than the last, not because of pain or illness, but because of the weight of memory returning in fragments. She had woken up a ghost in her own body, trapped in the sterile cocoon of a hospital bed, while her husband paced the hallway like a warden guarding a secret. They told her she was lucky, that it was a miracle, that some freak medical anomaly had saved her from the brink. But Clarissa knew better. She remembered the darkness, the cold, the deliberate stillness forced on her body by chemical precision. And most of all, she remembered the moment when the numbness cracked, the sharp sting of a hand across her face and the soft, trembling voice that followed. She had not been ready to return, but that voice had pulled her back. "Naomi," she whispered again, barely audible. The nurse beside her looked up. "Mrs. Whitmore?" Clarissa opened her eyes, her throat dry. "Naomi Moore, the woman who found me." The nurse hesitated, eyes darting to the door. "Your husband has instructed us not to—" "I don't care what he instructed," Clarissa interrupted, the edge in her voice more pronounced than she'd expected. "Get me the detective, Voloshin. I want to talk." An hour later, Roman Voloshin entered the room with a quiet knock. His expression was neutral, professional, but his eyes were attentive. Clarissa studied him, noting the way he moved, the quiet confidence in his manner. This was someone who paid attention, not just to words, but to the spaces between them. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, pulling a chair to her bedside, "you asked to see me." Clarissa nodded, her throat still raw. She reached for the glass of water on the tray and sipped slowly, her hand shaking. Voloshin waited patiently, not rushing her. "I'm not here because of a miracle," she began. "I'm here because I plan to disappear." He didn't blink. "Go on." Clarissa took another breath, steadying herself against the tide of emotion threatening to rise. My marriage wasn't what it looked like. It never was. Gregory controls everything. My phone, my money, even my food. I wasn't a wife. I was an ornament, something to polish and display. I tried to leave once, years ago, but he made it impossible. The threats, the lawyers, the surveillance, he reminded me in every way that I belonged to him. Voloshin didn't take notes. He simply listened. Then I met someone. His name was Danis. He worked in cybersecurity. At first, it was just conversation. Someone who listened. Someone who didn't look at me like property. But it grew, and we started to dream about leaving, starting over. And he said he knew people who could help. Clarissa closed her eyes for a moment. It was all supposed to be seamless. A medical procedure. A drug that would slow my body's systems down so completely that it would mimic death. Just long enough for a fake autopsy report to be filed, a private cremation arranged, and for Dennis to get me out. We planned it for months. I wired money to a crypto account. He handled the logistics. The night it happened, I drank the cocktail they gave me and laid down in my own bed, knowing that I wouldn't wake up for at least 24 hours. But something went wrong. Her hands gripped the sheets. I woke up in a freezer, a morgue, alone, trapped inside my own body, unable to move, to speak, and I realized Danis never came. Voloshin finally leaned back, his brow slightly furrowed. "You're saying this was a planned disappearance," he said slowly, "with forged documentation, falsified death certificates, and an escape route, all orchestrated with the help of a civilian accomplice." "Yes," she said, her voice tight, "but Dennis never intended to save me. I think he sold me out, or panicked, or worse, he wanted me dead." Voloshin didn't respond immediately. He stood and walked to the window, watching the shadows of clouds roll across the skyline. We suspected the condition was chemically induced. Our preliminary toxicology reports showed a synthetic neuroinhibitor, similar to those used in extreme sedation cases. He turned to her. "But we had no idea it was voluntary." "It was," she said, "at first, but I didn't plan on being abandoned." Voloshin nodded once. "Why tell me this now?" "Because the woman who saved me is being treated like a criminal," Clarissa said, "and because I don't trust my husband not to twist this into something else. He'll protect his name above all else. I want the truth out. I want Naomi cleared. And I want Dennis found." The detective's expression softened. "He may have just changed the entire course of this investigation." As Voloshin left the room, he placed a call to his partner. They had work to do. Meanwhile, Naomi sat alone in her apartment, clutching the folder Voloshin had given her. She had read it over and over again, the proof that something deeper was at play, that Clarissa had been chemically sedated, that the entire hospital had missed it, or worse, ignored it. She was startled by a knock at her door. This time it was not a detective. It was Clarissa's lawyer. "You're being summoned," he said simply. "Mrs. Whitmore has requested your presence, privately." Naomi hesitated. "Gregory will not be present. In fact, he's unaware." She made sure of it. Naomi nodded slowly. She knew she should be cautious, but something in her heart told her to go. The drive to the facility was quiet. She was ushered through back entrances and staff corridors until finally she stood in the doorway of Clarissa's suite. Clarissa looked smaller than Naomi remembered, frailer, but her eyes were sharp. "Come in," she said. Naomi stepped forward. "You saved my life," Clarissa said, her voice steady. "You saw what no one else did. You believed what your body was telling you, even when the evidence said otherwise. Thank you." Naomi shook her head. "You don't owe me anything." "Yes," Clarissa replied. "I do, and not just gratitude. The truth." She told Naomi everything: the plan, the lover, the escape, the betrayal. Naomi listened in silence, trying to piece together the full scope of what had nearly unfolded. "You trusted him," she said finally. "Dennis." "I did," Clarissa said. "He played his part well, until he didn't. And now? Now he's running, but not for long." Naomi nodded. "I believe you." Clarissa smiled faintly. "I hope the world will." The following days moved with strange momentum. Voloshin issued warrants, traced cryptocurrency trails, followed communications. Dennis had vanished, but his footprints were digital, and they were sloppy. Within a week, he was located attempting to board a private flight out of state under a false name. He was arrested on the tarmac. The news exploded. Not just that Clarissa Whitmore was alive, but that her death had been faked. That a criminal conspiracy had nearly succeeded. That the woman once accused of misconduct had, in fact, prevented a tragedy. Naomi's name was no longer whispered. It was printed in headlines. Hospital tech saves socialite from death plot. Black woman uncovers elite fraud with one brave act. She trusted her instinct and saved a life. Naomi didn't know how to feel about the sudden attention. Interviews were requested, documentaries pitched, but she declined most. It wasn't about the spotlight. It was about the truth. And finally, it was out. The press conference had been called on short notice, hastily organized under the polished marble dome of a hotel conference hall downtown, a space that normally hosted exclusive fundraising galas and luxury product launches. This time, however, the cameras were turned on Gregory Whitmore. Flanked by his attorneys, dressed immaculately in a navy suit that looked stitched onto his chiseled frame, he stood behind the podium with his trademark cold composure. There were no photographers shouting his name, no red carpet beneath his feet. The only lights flashing were those of the media, hungry for clarity, for drama, for a headline. He cleared his throat and addressed the room with a calmness that did not quite mask the tension stiffening his jaw. "In recent days, there has been a great deal of speculation surrounding the medical condition of my wife, Clarissa Whitmore. Many of these reports are exaggerated, inaccurate, and, frankly, irresponsible. We ask for privacy as our family continues to process a difficult and unexpected situation." He paused as murmurs rippled across the crowd. "There are rumors of deception, of criminal conspiracies, of internal hospital failings. Let me be absolutely clear. Any suggestion that I, or any member of my family, was involved in wrongdoing is categorically false. We are the victims of a deeply disturbing manipulation by individuals who took advantage of my wife's fragile state and our family's grief." He offered no names, no context, no mention of Clarissa's confession, only an artfully constructed narrative in which he remained the wounded husband, betrayed and bewildered. But outside the walls of the hall, the world was no longer so easy to control. Clarissa's decision to speak publicly through her attorney had ignited a fire that even Gregory's wealth and influence could not suppress. Her statement had been released just a day prior, read aloud to reporters with quiet, devastating precision. "I, Clarissa Whitmore, willingly entered a medically induced state designed to simulate death in order to escape an abusive marriage and a life in which I no longer felt safe or free. My husband, Gregory Whitmore, maintained absolute control over every aspect of my existence, including my finances, my relationships, and my autonomy. The plan was mine, but abandonment was not. I survived not because of careful design, but because of the courage of a woman who refused to ignore what others accepted. Naomi Moore saved my life." The impact was seismic. Social media erupted. Commentators dissected every word. Talk shows invited panels to debate the ethics of wealth, power, and control. Investigative journalists pounced on the Whitmore name, peeling back layers that had long gone unscrutinized. It began with the finances. Reporters uncovered a labyrinthine network of shell companies and overseas accounts used to shelter Gregory's assets. Then came whispers from former employees, nannies, assistants, drivers, who began speaking to the press about the volatile temper, the obsessive surveillance, the unspoken rules of silence within the estate. One brave ex-employee even admitted to seeing bruises on Clarissa's arms, and to being dismissed shortly after mentioning them aloud. It was the beginning of the end. Detective Voloshin worked behind the scenes, his team methodically assembling evidence not just of Gregory's character, but of potential involvement in Clarissa's near death. Though the sedative had been administered by a rogue doctor hired by Dennis, there was growing suspicion that Gregory may have known or even subtly encouraged the scheme to go awry. If Clarissa died, there would be no scandal, no divorce, only a lavish funeral and a widower bathed in public sympathy. What neither of the men had anticipated was Naomi. While the world began to dissect Gregory's life under a microscope, Naomi remained largely out of sight. She had declined all media appearances, instead offering one short written statement. "I did what I believed was right. I saw something others didn't. And I acted." This was never about fame or recognition. It was about doing the job with humanity, about seeing the person, not just the procedure. The hospital's internal review, which had begun as a formality, was now under public pressure to produce a transparent report. It soon became clear that not only had the attending pathologist failed to conduct a basic verification of death, but several administrators had rushed Clarissa's processing due to her last name. Corners were cut, protocols ignored. Naomi's objections had been dismissed without review. Now, in the harsh light of scrutiny, the entire institution scrambled to protect itself. The chief of pathology resigned. 3 staff members were suspended pending disciplinary hearings, and Naomi Moore, once placed on leave, was reinstated with a formal apology and full honors. In a rare move, the board offered her a promotion to lead the patient advocate in the hospital's ethics division. It was more than a title. It was a signal. Naomi accepted, but quietly. She had no interest in speeches or medals. Her reward was something deeper: justice, recognition, and the beginning of change. One evening, as she walked the now familiar halls of the hospital, new badge clipped to her blazer, staff nodding respectfully as she passed, she paused before the double doors leading to the quiet wing where she had first met Clarissa. The memory of that morning came back with uncanny clarity. The cold metal table, the sense of dread, the courage it had taken to follow an instinct louder than her fear. She stepped into the room where Clarissa was now recovering under her own name, by her own will. The 2 women looked at each other for a long moment. "I hear you're official now," Clarissa said with a faint smile. Naomi nodded. "I guess they finally believe me." "They should. You're the reason I'm still here. I only did what anyone would do." "No," Clarissa said firmly. "You did what no one else dared. That matters." Naomi sat in the chair beside the bed. "I keep thinking," she said quietly, "about how close it all came to ending differently. If I'd hesitated another minute." "But you didn't," Clarissa interrupted. You listened to your body, your heart, and I think a part of me heard you too, through the silence." They sat in comfortable quiet for a while, two women who had met at the intersection of death and awakening, bound not by history, but by survival. Elsewhere, Gregory's legal troubles mounted. He was formally charged with obstruction and suspected conspiracy to commit fraud, though prosecutors admitted that proving his direct involvement in Clarissa's plan would be challenging. Still, the tide had turned. The public no longer saw him as the grieving husband, but as a symbol of unchecked power crumbling beneath its own arrogance. His empire suffered. Board members of his companies began to distance themselves. Sponsorships were pulled, luxury partnerships severed ties. His net worth plummeted, but worse than the money was the loss of reputation, the thing he had cherished most. In the court of public opinion, the verdict was clear. Clarissa filed for divorce with the support of a legal team empowered by evidence, witness testimony, and a wave of public backing. She announced the creation of a foundation to support women escaping coercive relationships, funded not by Gregory's fortune, but by the book deal she signed within weeks of reclaiming her identity. And Naomi, always reluctant to step into the spotlight, found herself receiving letters from across the country, from nurses, from young black women, from people who had once been afraid to speak up, to question authority, to trust their instincts. They called her brave, humble, a hero, but Naomi only smiled, folded the letters, and tucked them into a drawer. Her work was not finished. The hospital changed its protocols. Trainings were introduced on implicit bias, patient verification, and ethical responsiveness. Naomi helped lead the seminars. She spoke calmly, clearly, never pointing fingers, only telling the truth of what happened and why it mattered. And sometimes, when no one was watching, she returned to the morgue. Not in sadness, but in reflection. The cold never bothered her. It reminded her where she came from, where she stood when no one stood with her. She would touch the side of the stainless steel table where Clarissa had once lain and remember the slap that started it all. Not an act of violence, but of defiance, of faith, of insistence that life was still there beneath the silence. She had changed a life, but more than that, she had changed a system, and it had only just begun. The headlines had begun to fade. Not disappear entirely. Clarissa's story still circulated in long-form profiles and slow-burn documentaries, but the sensationalist flurry had calmed. The media, ever hungry, had moved on to newer scandals, fresher disasters. Yet, for Naomi, the shift in attention marked the beginning of something quieter and more profound. Her world didn't return to what it was before. It couldn't. The trajectory of her life had permanently curved into a new shape, one drawn not by ambition but by necessity, by the fact that she had dared to act when no one else would. That action had changed the life of one woman, but the ripples continued outward, touching places Naomi could never have predicted. At Halcyon Medical, everything felt subtly different. The change wasn't immediate, and it wasn't uniform. Some staff greeted Naomi now with warmth, others with wary respect. A few avoided eye contact altogether, ashamed or perhaps simply uncomfortable confronting the fact that they had once stood by in silence while she was humiliated and suspended. But Naomi wasn't interested in vengeance. She wasn't keeping a tally. What mattered was that something fundamental had shifted, not just in how she was treated, but in how the institution saw itself. Her new role as lead patient advocate had come with a modest office on the third floor, nestled between administration and compliance. The view from her window overlooked the eastern courtyard where staff took their breaks, and each morning, she watched familiar faces sip coffee beneath budding trees. It was spring now. Fitting. Everything felt like a cautious emergence from winter. The role itself suited her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Naomi had always paid attention. She'd always listened. To patients, to nurses, to what went unsaid in the rooms others passed through too quickly. Now she was being asked to formalize that instinct, to help shape policy, and mediate between staff and patients when something went wrong. And things did go wrong. Every week, someone called her office with a complaint, a concern, a cry for help. She handled each with patience and focus, never forgetting the cold indifference she once encountered. She initiated monthly ethics seminars, mandatory for all staff, where they reviewed cases of medical misjudgment and implicit bias. They began small, 10 attendees in a conference room, but they grew. Soon, entire departments were attending voluntarily, asking questions, confronting uncomfortable truths about how quickly even good people could look past a voice that didn't sound like theirs. The hospital administration, sensitive to public image after the Whitmore incident, supported her efforts. But Naomi didn't care for optics. She cared for action. The real kind, the kind that wasn't captured in press releases. When a young black mother in the maternity ward reported being ignored during labor, Naomi visited the floor herself. When an elderly immigrant man filed a complaint that no one would explain his discharge papers in his language, Naomi ensured translation services were expanded. These weren't grand gestures, but they mattered. To the people involved, they meant everything. She remained in quiet contact with Clarissa, though their meetings became less frequent. Clarissa, now officially divorced, had moved into a modest brownstone across town and spent most of her time coordinating her new foundation. She had begun speaking at domestic violence shelters under a pseudonym, not as the former wife of Gregory Whitmore, but simply as a woman who had once felt trapped and found a way out. Naomi had been invited to serve on the foundation's board. She declined the title, but continued offering her insights when asked. Sometimes Naomi wondered what her life would look like now had she not followed that instinct. If she had done what was expected, filed the paperwork, prepared the tools, turned away from the strange warmth in Clarissa's skin. The thought chilled her more than any cold room ever had. She could still see that moment, the raised hand, the strike, the impossible flutter of eyelids. It played in her mind not as a trauma, but as a threshold. She had crossed it, and there was no going back. Late one evening, as she sat alone in her office reviewing a patient grievance file, there was a knock on the door. It was Olivia Marks, the hospital's PR director, a woman who had once sat at a table where Naomi's reputation was nearly sacrificed. "I wanted to say something," Olivia said, standing awkwardly in the doorway. Naomi looked up. "Sure." "I was wrong," Olivia said quietly. "Back then, when this all started, I treated you like a liability, like a threat. I didn't even let myself consider that you might be right." Naomi didn't respond immediately. She simply watched her. "I've learned a lot," Olivia continued, "not just about you, about all of it. I've seen how you work, what you're doing here. I just wanted to say, I respect you. I hope we can do better. Together." Naomi nodded. "Thank you." It was a small moment, but it was honest, and Naomi had learned to accept small, honest moments for the victories they were. Later that week, she was invited to speak at a regional conference for healthcare professionals. The theme was accountability and trust. She hesitated at first. Public speaking had never been her ambition, and she had no desire to be a celebrity of any kind. But a part of her knew that her story could serve a purpose beyond herself. So, she accepted. The auditorium was full, not with reporters or cameras, but with nurses, technicians, administrators, people like her. People who understood what it meant to be overlooked, or afraid to speak, or punished for noticing something others wanted ignored. She took the stage in a simple navy blazer and white blouse. No teleprompter, no speechwriter. "I wasn't supposed to be the one who saw it," she began. "That's what they told me, in 100 different ways. Not directly, not even cruelly, just constantly. I was just a tech, just a name on a schedule. And when I felt something was wrong, they told me to move on, to be quiet, to trust the process. But I didn't. I trusted what I saw, what I felt. And because of that, someone is alive today who wouldn't be. Don't let anyone convince you that your voice doesn't matter, that your instincts are wrong just because they don't come with a title. Sometimes the person everyone ignores is the one who sees the truth first." She stepped off the stage to quiet applause, deep, respectful, sincere. Afterwards, people came up to her, not in crowds, but one at a time. A nurse from a small-town clinic thanked her for validating what she'd always believed about listening. A young black med student said Naomi's story had reminded her why she kept going, even when professors ignored her hand in class. A white male administrator simply said, "I've been thinking differently. I'm grateful." Naomi returned home that night exhausted but content. She made tea, sat on her small sofa, and let the silence settle. Her apartment was still modest, her life still simple, but inside, everything had changed. She thought of her parents, her father's laugh, her mother's strength. She thought of her first day at Halcyon, knees shaking, voice quiet, heart determined. She thought of Clarissa, of the slap, of the breath that followed. And she thought of all the others, still unseen, still unheard, who needed someone to speak when they couldn't. Naomi wasn't perfect. She didn't want to be. She only wanted to keep doing the work. One patient, one truth, one quiet, steady act of courage at a time. She closed her eyes, the sounds of the city drifting through the open window. Somewhere, a siren wailed. Somewhere, a life was changing. And somewhere, deep within, she knew this was only the beginning. It had been almost 6 months since the morning Naomi Moore's gloved hand struck the face of a woman declared dead. 6 months since a single impulsive act tore the thin veil off an intricate web of deception, silence, and abuse. The world had turned over more than once in that time. News cycles shifted, scandals came and went, and public interest gradually wandered to newer faces, newer stories. But for Naomi, the change hadn't been temporary. It had taken root in the marrow of her days, woven itself into the very rhythm of her life. What had once seemed like an accident of courage now felt like destiny, not in a grand, dramatic sense, but in the quiet unfolding of purpose she had never expected to find. She walked through the halls of Halcyon Medical with steady steps, her posture relaxed but alert, her ID badge clipped to her chest with the nameplate below it now reading, Senior Patient Advocate. Staff greeted her with a mix of familiarity and something more. Deference, perhaps, or gratitude. But Naomi didn't linger on what people thought of her. What mattered was that they listened now, and more importantly, they listened to others too. She had watched the culture of the hospital shift, not in sudden upheavals, but in subtle rewrites of daily behavior. Nurses spoke up without fear. Orderlies asked questions. Even physicians, some of whom once saw her as little more than a moving body in a uniform, consulted her on decisions involving patient communication. It was late spring now. The air in the courtyard behind the hospital carried the scent of blooming magnolias. and the sky had taken on that soft blue particular to the season when winter's residue was finally gone for good. Naomi stood outside for a moment between meetings, letting the sun touch her skin. It felt earned, this warmth. Not a gift, but a consequence. A group of interns walked past her, chattering about rounds and assignments. One of them, a young woman with braids and a clipboard too large for her hands, gave Naomi a smile that was hesitant and admiring all at once. Naomi nodded back, remembering all too well what it meant to be new, to be unsure, to question whether you belonged in places built by people who never looked like you. That girl didn't know the full story. She might never know. But she knew enough to recognize a woman who had spoken when silence was expected. Inside, the day continued. A meeting with the new ethics officer. A debrief with a family whose daughter had suffered a misdiagnosis, now corrected thanks to a nurse who spoke up early. Naomi facilitated the conversation, not as a mediator, but as a translator of trust, guiding both sides toward understanding. It wasn't always easy. The work could be tense, emotionally raw, but it felt necessary, and it no longer felt lonely. The office she had once hesitated to decorate now bore signs of permanence. A small framed photo of her parents stood beside a vase of dried lavender. A hand-drawn thank you card from a pediatric patient was pinned to the corkboard, its crayon colors bright and unapologetically messy. A certificate from the Regional Health Board recognizing her contributions hung modestly beside her degree. Later that afternoon, she received a visitor. It wasn't unusual. Patients, staff, even press sometimes found their way to her door. But this one gave her pause. Clarissa. She hadn't seen her in weeks, though they still exchanged messages now and then. Clarissa entered the office quietly, her posture lighter than it had been in their last meeting. She wore jeans and a soft cotton blouse, her hair in loose waves, her face free of makeup. "I was in the area," she said with a gentle smile, "and I realized I hadn't said thank you in person, not properly." Naomi gestured to the chair across from her. "You've said it more than once. Not like this." Clarissa sat down, folding her hands in her lap. She looked different. Not just physically, though the transformation from high society perfection to grounded womanhood was striking, but in the way she carried herself. There was no longer the brittle elegance of a woman on display, only presence. "I've filed the final paperwork for the foundation," she said. "We launch next month. We've already got our first grants out the door." Naomi smiled. "That's fast." I had time to think, to plan, while recovering, while hiding, while facing what I ran from. It helped to have a vision, something bigger than me. Naomi nodded. She understood that. "We're calling it the Evelyn House," Clarissa continued, "after my grandmother. She was the only one who ever told me I had worth apart from what I could give someone else. It's a good name. We're setting up transitional housing, legal services, mental health support, everything I needed and didn't have. We'll be in 3 cities by the end of the year." Naomi felt a quiet swell of pride. "You're not just surviving anymore?" "No," Clarissa said. "I'm living, and it started with that moment. That room. You brought me back." Naomi looked down, her fingers brushing the edge of her desk. "I didn't know it would work. I just knew I couldn't not try." Clarissa's eyes glistened. "That's the part I keep thinking about. How much the world depends on people doing the right thing even when they don't know the outcome." They sat for a while without speaking, the silence full, not awkward. Finally, Clarissa stood. "I'll leave you to your work. But if you ever want to come by one of the houses, meet the women. Maybe help train our staff. There's a place for you." Naomi nodded. "Thank you. I just might." After Clarissa left, Naomi stood at the window for a long time, watching the way the sun filtered through the branches below. The past months had changed more than just her career. They had recalibrated her sense of place, of power, of worth. She no longer doubted herself in the same way. The fear hadn't vanished. It still lurked in small corners, but it no longer ruled her. That evening, she walked home instead of taking the bus. The city was loud, alive, and indifferent in its usual way, but Naomi moved through it with a calm anchored deep inside. She stopped at a street vendor and bought a bag of roasted peanuts, something her father used to do on Fridays after work. The taste was nostalgic and grounding. When she reached her apartment building, she took the stairs instead of the elevator. Halfway up, she paused, looking out through the narrow window overlooking the block. Kids played on the sidewalk below. A teenager helped an elderly man with his groceries. Somewhere a radio played an old soul song, and, for a moment, the world felt strangely whole. Back inside, she opened her mailbox and found a plain envelope with no return address. She opened it carefully. Inside was a note written in deliberate cursive. To the woman who saved her life and unknowingly saved mine. I was one of the interns that day. I saw you. I believed you. I speak louder now because of you. There was no signature. Naomi folded the note and placed it gently in the drawer with the others. The drawer was fuller now. Dozens of messages from strangers, colleagues, even patients, each a reminder that courage, however small, echoed far beyond its origin. She turned off the lights, lit a candle, and sat by the window. The city moved on below her, unaware of the woman in the quiet room above, who had once faced a lifeless body and chosen to believe in life instead. Naomi closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of the candle's slow burn. She had no need for monuments or speeches, no desire for statues or headlines. Her story was etched in breath returned, in truths revealed, in systems nudged ever so slightly toward justice. Tomorrow she would wake up and go to work. She would walk the same halls, meet new patients, fight new battles. But tonight, in the hush of her home, she allowed herself a moment of stillness. Not grief, not memory, just stillness and gratitude. Because she had found something she never expected, a new life, her own. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch our next videos to uncover more real-life twists. And if you think someone needs to hear this, share it.